Hey guys, welcome back to a pretty messy cave during the off season, in between ice fishing and getting stuff ready for the season. But I just wanted to touch base with you guys because today's interview with Larry Ramsell, we had some issues getting Larry's video feed up and running. So we made the decision on the fly to just record audio only. But because I wanted you guys to be able to at least access this through YouTube, I thought I will at least get this audio out. I'll throw some pictures in over top. It'll be mostly just for you guys to listen to, but I thought it was really important to keep our core audience of 54 Bust on the YouTube to have access to this and not have to go to a podcast site. So that's why today you're not going to see that video interview. Maybe in the future, when we go back and talk with Larry, we can do something where we can set up the video and have a little bit more time. But again, guys, I thought it was really important to try and get this one out to you guys as quickly as we could. When I started doing this 54 Bus podcast, I wanted to personally reach out to some of my idols, some of my heroes, some of the heroes of the sport. Recently, I've had on Jim Sarek, Joe Bucher, and Steve Hiding, the original Musky Hunter crew, and that led me down a history avenue, which I really like. I'm a history buff. I've told people that on this podcast. And the next guest that I have here tonight was just a natural progression of that. Everybody knows my guest tonight. Larry Ramsell is the muskie historian. And when I thought about the history of Eagle Lake, for a lot of people, it starts with Steve Herbeck for good reason. He was the most prominent guy here to really put it on the world stage, but there was a huge history of big muskies and a lot of muskies caught in northwestern Ontario and on Eagle Lake. And I know Larry knows a lot about that. We're going to talk about that. But Larry, welcome to 54 Bus Podcast. And I know you got something really exciting on the horizon with Alumacraft boats. What can you tell us about that, and what else is exciting with Larry Ramsell?
Well, Lumacraft hired a Canadian film crew last fall to do a documentary on me, and started out in October on Lake Vermilion, and then they came to visit me here in Hayward in the winter, and we're 3 days here, and then we went to Quebec for 3 days, and ended up in a kind of a neat little. There were some parts of it I wish they'd have left out, like me with no shirt on. Not a pretty sight. But anyway, that I saw the premiere a couple of weeks ago, and it will be released on Lumacraft's page on YouTube on May 1st at 5 p.m. And it's called Musky Man. And you can go to the Lumacraft page right now and see a trailer.
That is exciting. When I seen that posted, myself, like a lot of other people in the muskie industry, that instantly got the blood going. Anytime that you're involved with any kind of project, I think everybody stands up and takes notice, and again, for good reason. So I'm really looking forward to that. I know a lot of my listeners and my audience will be absolutely looking, forward to that. And it's great that you've been a part of so many podcasts and videos these past couple of years. I think it's so important to remember the history, keep the history of the sport alive, and in a lot of ways that helps us shape decisions going forward by learning from mistakes or learning where guys like yourself, Larry, have made the sport a better place, and in a lot of ways you've transcended this sport, which I think is really key for a sport like musky fishing, because we are so niche and so small. It's really nice to see personalities like yourself get beyond just the scope of muskies. So I just want to say thank you so much for everything you've done to this sport, and I can't stress that enough, that I'm sure a lot of people feel the same way. But I
Well,
do want to
thank you. Appreciate that.
Oh, you're more than welcome. I do want to talk about Eagle Lake. So I've grown up in Vermilion Bay on the shores of Eagle Lake my entire life. And like a lot of locals, we didn't fish Eagle Lake a lot growing up because it had that notorious reputation as a bottom end killer of boats. It was littered with rocks. It was one of those lakes that you didn't just venture out into the unknown without a guide or without some help. So it wasn't for myself until really modern recent times for me that I started to really explore eagle, love it. But growing up here, I heard stories of guides at all the camps catching, these huge muskies. There's reports of, fish over the 60-inch mark. There's stories of guys hooking one in a rowboat and being pulled around in front of the government dock. Like, I've heard all these stories. I've heard the stories of guys catching these fish as big as a railway tie, and back in the day, we all know it was catch and kill, right? Like, everybody knows that. But there was
Yeah,
a
not everybody did kill, but most generally, they weren't real easy to come by. So when they caught one, they kept it.
Okay, so that makes sense. To best of our knowledge, it was like everybody was killing those fish that did catch them, that were going for them, right? And there was this
Yeah, and
darker.
to give you the other side, of that
Yep.
coin, if you want to talk some early history,
Yep.
and I don't know whether you're aware of this or not, but there were no roads to Eagle Lake until 1933. So the only way you could get to Eagle Lake to fish Eagle Lake was by train. But after 1933, when the road was put in, I can imagine what kind of condition it was in those days. But that's when finally musky fishermen were able to get to Eagle Lake, and one of the early pioneers was a gentleman named Bert Claflin, who wrote a musky book called Musky Fishing in 1948. And I grew up with that book. That's probably what got me hooked more than anything else. But he told about hiring a guide and telling the guide he wanted to go where nobody else has gone. And he said they traveled for 3 hours before they stopped to fish. And of course, he was a catch and release fisherman, so he released everything he caught. But that's kind of how things got started. And there was probably some locals that was fishing it before that, of course, but the general public couldn't get to Eagle Lake until 1933.
Did Eagle Lake at that early time already have a reputation as like trophy waters for all species? Obviously, a lot of people don't talk about that early history of, especially the sports side of fishing. Was Eagle Lake and Lake of the Woods and even a place like Wabigoon, which again is right on the railway line there, did those lakes have that reputation early on, Larry?
Not to my knowledge. Um, I think once that the roads opened up and tourists were able to get there, and serious musky heads, you know how us really hardcore guys would chase the biggest, we chase the big bite wherever we can. And I think once that started, for instance, I've got some early brochures from some of the Eagle Lake camps in the 1930s with 4 or 5 guys standing behind a pole with 4 or 5 big muskies hanging on it. And then, of course, you've got the 2 world record potential fish from 1939 and 1940. So that's probably what really rang the bell for musky fishermen as far as Eagle Lake was concerned. The
That
the 1939 Coleman fish weighed 60 pounds 8 ounces, and it was the first ever legitimized 60 pound muskie. And of course, Ed Walden caught a 61.9 the following year, but it had already been beaten twice by bogus fish, so actually it wasn't beaten. But anyway, it remained the Canadian record for 41 years, I think it was. So
that
Eagle had an early history of some big fish, and once the public could get there, that opened the door.
Yeah, early on when I grew up in the early 70s, I heard the stories of, again, those huge fish being caught on Eagle and some of the other lakes in the region too. I know a lot of the even smaller lakes in the area when, fast forward to when Steve Herbeck was coming up here and Tony Grant was coming, our mutual friend Kevin Wegner was coming up. They were fishing a lot of the lakes around Eagle, and they all had, really, really nice muskies in it. These lakes have changed obviously over the course of the last 50 years, but going back to those early days, there was not a lot of musky anglers, obviously, not like we have today. But when you're talking that early time period, how many true musky anglers do you think, Larry, was there in the Midwest or in Canada? Because, I mean, for myself, knowing a little bit about the history of our area, there's a really small number of names that are associated with those early years of musky fishing, as you know, especially on a lake like Eagle.
And I think you've got to consider a couple of things. For instance, during the late 30s, World War II was getting started. Um, Before that, you had the stock market crash of '29, and there weren't a lot of people except the real rich, wealthy people that had money to do something like go chase muskies on Eagle Lake. So there, you could research the early history of resorts on Eagle, and you won't find very many. There's a lot more now, but early days there weren't a lot of places for people to go, even if they wanted to fish muskies. So, and of course, the people didn't have their own boat like they do today, and motors that in those days were small or worthless, and it was not an easy proposition to fish a 70,000 acre lake with the equipment that they had in those days.
That's something that we talk about a lot well, this past weekend my brother-in-law's got a cabin on Eagle Lake, and we were out there for the weekend and we were ice fishing, and we put 100 miles on the snowmobile in one day. And when we do stuff like that, or we take the boat from Vermilion Bay and go down to Osborne Bay, and you put on 35 miles one direction, we sit back and we think, how did the early pioneers of our sport manage this with the little boats and the little outboards? And it's a testament to just the time they put in to learn lakes like this. Today we take GPS chips and stuff like that for granted. Back then that wasn't even thought of. So it to me it's such an interesting time when those early pioneers of the sport were really breaking ground for the first time on a lot of these lakes. When was the first time you were up on Eagle Lake, Larry?
1964, my dad and my friend and I went up there for a week, and what we did is we would venture out, and each day we'd go a little further to learn new territory. But the thing that I found was most helpful to me was as we were traveling along, instead of watching ahead where I was going, I'd turn and look back to see what the territory would look like coming back so we could find our way home. Because it was very easy to get down in the islands and get lost. So it was just a process of kind of like eating an elephant, one bite at a time. Just go a little further each day, and took years to expand all to the main part of the lake, but it was not an easy process. Of course, no depth finders. Electric motors were just starting to come into vogue, but we didn't have any. So our first motor was a 7.5 horse piece of junk that went out the second day we were there, and we had to use a camp boat, which would happen to be a 15 horse motor, which was big in those days, but now that's a kicker motor. So things have really changed since we started up there.
You said a couple things that really hit home with me. And obviously, we started with small boats, when we were younger kids and stuff, fishing with dad. And then we graduated up to a boat with I think our dad's first had like an 80 horse on it, which was when we were kids, that was amazing. So we've kind of all gone
Yeah.
through those things. But what you said about sitting backwards, Larry, my wife's mother used to work up at Long Legged Stork Lake Lodge, and we spent probably 6, 7 summers out there. I did some guiding out there, really learned the lake. But when I first went up to Long Legged and Stork, I would ride around with Kyla's dad, and I would sit backwards and I would study where it is we've came from, what it looks like, where the natural landmarks are. And my wife, Kyla, always asks me, she's like, how do you learn this lake so fast? And I'm like, because I'm looking where we've came, not where we're going, because I need to understand
Right.
how to get back. So when you said that, it really hit home with me. And I think a lot of people jump in a boat, even with a guide, and they don't really pay attention. they're just kind of sitting there. And I think that's something that when people do hire a guide, not study, but really be aware of your surroundings and have landmarks, take some mental notes of where you go. So I just thought that's really interesting that you brought that up from such a an early time, that was probably the only way you guys could navigate.
Right. We didn't, the maps weren't all that good, and of course the reefs weren't marked. And the ones that resort owners would put bottles on, the Indians would come by and cut them off because they didn't want you finding the spots that easy. So it was an interesting game. We hit a few rocks here and there. I totaled at least one motor I know on a reef, so it was exciting.
Those days in the obviously like the 60s to 70s, that's when I'm starting to hear of the history. And going to public school, we would go down to the government dock in Vermilion Bay, and we'd cast off and catch some rock bass, and you might catch a 30-inch northern, and that was a big fish. And then every once in a while we'd go down there and you'd see a muskie laying up in the shallows there, and it would just be one of those things like, holy, this thing is massive. And it, even at an early age for me, it always kind of perked my imagination. And
Yeah. In fact, I've even caught muskies in front of the government dock.
I'm sure most of us have at one point or another. A lot of our big fish are caught with inside of the government dock in Vermilion Bay. I mean, you could say that of any part of Eagle, but of that time period, Larry, there was a bit of a history that I heard growing up of the guys that were snagging fish with treble hooks. And I'm not sure exactly how to explain it. I know you will explain it better than me, but that was something that was fairly well known in the area, that there was certainly a couple guys that were doing it. I know one was a guide, and it's a bit of a black eye on the sport. I don't know that it was super uncommon in that time. Is Can you
Well,
enlighten us on that?
in my experience, I didn't ever fish with the gentleman, but I had two different friends that hired him. One of them fired him before he ever got in the boat because he told him he wasn't fishing. But he had a little 3-foot rod with the snagging hook on it, and he'd leave that in the transom well. And of course, in those days, they ran the boat backwards with their foot, so he always saw the fish first. And the other friend of mine that did actually spend the day on the water with him, he raised a nice fish, and the guide says, "You want that fish?" And he grabbed his little 3-foot rod. He was going to snag it. And of course, my buddy said, "Absolutely not." But that did go on quite a bit, at least from that one perspective that I'm aware of.
Okay. Was that something that was done in other areas? Because I've heard the rumors. I don't personally know. Is that something that you see in other areas, Larry?
It's not something I've heard of uh, with any with any regularity other than those years, that period of time. It was probably through the 1970s, I think, when most of that went on, at least what I'm familiar with. But it could have been before that, could have been after that, could have been more people involved than just this one guide. But yeah, it was. I don't think it was real common.
Okay, well that's kind of nice to know, because I think a lot of us have heard rumors of that. I want to take it to a slightly better part of history. And one of my friends, Jeff Morrow, was the manager at Temple Bay Lodge for a number of years. He was a guide before that. And he's told me the stories of when the guys would come in after catching a muskie and they would have it in the boat. They would fly a white flag. They would come into shore. Nobody was allowed to touch fish, and they would go put on good clothes. They would come down and pose for the pictures with this fish. Is that accurate? Accurate, because that sounds like.
Yeah, the muskie flag, as far as I can tell, at least as far back as 1908, that was a practice. We used to do it all the time in the 60s and 70s and 80s. So, but as far as putting the different clothes on, that was I think late 1800s to early 1900s. When basically back in those days, nobody had a camera, so a lot of the big fish had to be taken to the photo shop in town, and of course they took the opportunity to change clothes before they went in, and that's where that came from.
Mm.
But as far as from the mid 1900s on, I don't think that was much of a practice because everybody had a camera by then, and usually they took a picture of the fish right after it was caught in the boat, and then more pictures when they got back to the dock when they kept them back in the keep days.
So
So
when guys brought fish into, just for lack of a better place, just Temple Bay Lodge on Eagle Lake, and they would bring a big fish in, pose with it, other people would gather around. How big of a deal was it in in those 50s, 60s, 70s when a big fish came into camp? Was that something that was was rare?
well, it wasn't rare, but it was absolutely a magnet to anybody that was in camp, whether they were musky fishermen or not. Always the crowds gathered around. One time, my cousin and I were up there in September, and we caught a mid 25-pound fish roughly, and let it go. But we still flew the flag when we went back to camp, and everybody come running out of the camp when we pulled up to shore, and they're looking in the boat. Well, where's the fish? I said, well, we let it go. And the mentality of that time period was, well, why didn't you keep it? I would have taken it,
Hmm.
So it was kind of a foreign thing for somebody to let a legal muskie go. But it caught on when it finally did catch on. It caught on beyond all belief.
which which leads me into the next question about the history and how it changed. And Pete Mana talks about it a lot as being one of the guides in his area that, made that change of, I'm not going to keep fish in my boat. But what what triggered that change in the industry, Larry? Was it just the guides that said we have to do something different, or was there something behind the scenes?
Well, I think the guides probably started it because they could see the writing on the wall that if they didn't, start letting some of those fish go, there wouldn't be anything left to catch, and that's still the case today. And that's what I'm going to get off subject here for a second, but that's one of the things that scares me, even at my late stage of life. This forward-facing sonar is not a good thing for the fishery, and but I think the guides probably started it. Talk to their clients, convince them to let a fish go, and then once the muskie clubs got involved and finally realized that that's the thing that needs to be done, then it went crazy and went like wildfire. But it took it took 10 to 15 years of nudging to get people interested in doing it, and then after it took hold for about 10 years, the next generation, that's all they would think about. For instance, you take a 12, 15-year-old kid out back in the late 70s, early 80s, they wouldn't dream of knocking one in the head. They'd get mad if you didn't let it go. In fact, my dad was so hard-headed, I told him one time when we were fishing, I caught a small one, I said, I'm going to let this fish go. I said, if you want it, you're going to have to net it. Well, damned if he didn't. But, that's just the generation he came from. Spent money, worked hard to catch fish. He couldn't take it home and eat it. But that mentality thankfully changed, or we wouldn't be having the fishery we've got today.
No, and I think I think in a lot of ways that change was inevitable because it wasn't going to be sustainable the way things were going. And obviously when you fast forward into today and the amount of anglers and pressure and the boats and stuff that we have, it you couldn't have sustained a fishery if it was a catch and even partially keep. So those are all
Right.
the positives of change, right? So I mean that part is amazing. When
But
you
if I might interrupt, that part's going to get lost if we get a whole bunch of newbies coming into the sport because of forward-facing sonar, and they're catching fish out of deep water and they don't know how to handle them, or they're catching them out of shallow water and don't know how to handle them, we're going to have mortality that's equivalent to the kill days. It's just it can get that bad that quick,
Yeah,
because you take a young guy that doesn't, he's not a musky head, he just, I got a chance to catch a big fish because Daddy's got a boat that's got a forward-facing sonar on it, and I can find a fish and catch it and go out and catch three in one day. He's a hero, but they're all going to be dead fish.
yeah, I agree, and I do want to touch on that subject in just a bit. There's something else about Eagle Lake and my area that I think is is unique to this area, and that was Bobby's Sport Shop, which my wife manages now. But in the early days of Bobby's Sport Shop, it was Alan and Bobby Dudar. I know you were there, and for a lot of people coming up to this part of northwestern Ontario, it was really the only sports shop for a long distance either direction. And my early memories of it being a kid is they had higher end stuff that you couldn't get at any of the other, bait shops where you could get your minnows and stuff. What do you
Yeah,
remember?
if you didn't bring it from the States with you, that'd be the only place you have a chance to find it.
Yeah.
That's for sure.
What was your early memories of Alan and Bobby? Because they were characters for sure.
Absolutely, characters. Uh, to give you an idea, they had their own ideas of what should be done and what bait should be done what with, and my buddy had a big slim bucktail, marathon big slim bucktail, and it got eat up by northerners, and so he wanted to replace it, and he went in and took one off the wall, found one on the wall just the same color that he wanted, and he told Bobby or his brother one that he'd take this, and the first thing Bobby did was get a pair of cutters and cut the swivel off the front of the bucktail. And my buddy says, "Well, what the hell did you do that for?" He said, "Well, you got to get rid of that thing. It doesn't do any good." Well, my buddy refused to buy it. That's the only one he had. So he kind of cost himself a sale by getting a little jumpy there, but that was something we laughed about for years.
Yeah, that sounds like them. They When my wife started working at the shop, Alan was still there, and he was loud and boisterous, and people would come in and remember him from the year before. He built, a great rapport with a number of guys, and like you said, it was really the only shop where you could get, that higher end gear, and especially the musky stuff. And to this day, my wife, she really prides herself on carrying a big selection of musky gear, rods, tackle. And there's some other shops in the area now that are finally starting to carry a lot of that. But for a number of years, that really was one of the only spots, and it was really unique to our area and Eagle Lake. So I think that's definitely worth mentioning. When Eagle Lake started to transition in the 80s, I remember going out there and fishing walleyes out at Viking Reef at nighttime, and I was young. I'm going to say there was 100 boats. That's an exaggeration, but there was so many boats.
50 at least.
Yeah,
Yeah.
night fishing walleyes out on Viking Reef, and that's when limits were six per person. And Eagle Lake went through that transformation where it almost got decimated in the walleye fishery, and they brought on the no night fishing rule, which I believe was to protect the walleyes. I don't think to the best of my knowledge, it didn't really wasn't put in place to protect muskies, but it's had the byproduct of really protecting the muskies on Eagle Lake from that night pressure. What's your recollections of that time period, Larry?
Yeah, it was strictly to protect the breeder walleyes. They were just, so many of the 10 pounders were being taken that they were afraid they were going to just decimate the breeding population, and so that was the main thing. The muskies had nothing to do with that rule coming on. It was all walleyes.
But would you agree that being a byproduct of that ruling has helped Eagle Lake maintain its ability to, continually produce big fish. It For us, I'll just add that it's just a rule that's second nature up here. And for a lot of local Canadians in my area, none of us night fish. It just the bugs are so bad up here that it's light so late in the evening and light so early in the morning that it's just not something that a lot of Canadians do. And I do know that a lot, especially in that Minnesota area. I see so many big fish caught at night. Would you feel that having a night fishing ban across the board would help those muskie populations?
Yeah, definitely in some of those situations, like in Minnesota, they're getting tremendous pressure. But yeah, eagle, even before the night ban on eagle, we didn't do much. We didn't fish maybe a half hour after dark, if we fished after dark at all. Like you said, the bugs would drive you over crazy for one thing. But yeah, it's something that would be another way to manage the lake. Most guys that fish at night wouldn't like it, but then
Well, I think there's got to be, a couple sides to every argument, and I agree with so much of, the negative side of forward facing sonar. I do see the ability to bring in new anglers with it, whether it's, any type of sport fishing, the younger
but is that
generation.
good or is that bad?
I don't know. That's the thing, that we need to get more pure anglers into the sport, but there's no question that the younger generation feel more at home watching that screen and feel connected to the fish. I'm not saying it's right, wrong, or otherwise. And I think all the species of fish are at risk, not just muskies. So I think we could agree
Oh,
on that.
absolutely, absolutely.
So I think
Well,
there's a lot there.
let me give you my perspective.
Okay.
I'm 83 years old. I've got two bad shoulders and a bad back, and I don't want any part of it. You would think that somebody in my condition would love to be able to sit in the chair and watch the screen and, oh, there's one, let's make 6 casts and see if we can catch it. I don't want any part of it. It's just, that's not musky fishing. That's musky catching. It ain't musky fishing. That's my feeling on the matter.
Yeah, and I can certainly, see that side of it. We've used it the past couple of years, and ironically enough, our worst year number wise was last year using it. So we don't personally, we don't go around sharpshooting it. To us, it's part of our system. I use it more or less like side imaging, because side imaging up here on these shield lakes really doesn't show you a lot. It's not like fishing those sand flats in Minnesota where you can see a fish out in the
Yeah.
sand. Up here at the side imaging, it's so much harder to spot fish on these rocky shorelines. We use it as part of what we do. I totally understand, both sides of it. I've watched my brother-in-laws lose tournaments to guys that were running forward facing sonar in walleye tournaments. So I totally understand all the sides of it. I look at some of the places in the states, and I'm gonna just be honest, I don't know what all the rules are in each state, but when I look at the ability to have 3 rods trolling, to me that doesn't seem like fair catch, because for me, I can't do that in Ontario. So to me, that's an easy one. Just take away the extra rods, limit it to 1 rod per angler. The other one is when I see guys dragging a sucker, or even stranger to us, a live pike while they're casting. To me, that doesn't feel like fair catch, because they're running two
Except,
rods with
except
live bait. So there's,
but you can't even do that in Ontario.
and we can't do
One,
that in Ontario. So
if you're running a live bait, that whoever's got that rod can't cast.
that's right. And I think when I talk to a lot of people from these areas where they can do that, they don't realize that in Canada, like, those rules just don't apply. Like, we're 1 rod per person. If I have a sucker on my rod, that's it. I can't cast. So you
Right.
have to be a lot more diligent with what you're doing. So when I hear the argument of we have to ban forward facing sonar, it's killing our sport, I look at, well, let's take the low hanging fruit first, ban the night fishing. That's going to save these fish the pressure at night. Take away the multiple rods, limit it to one rod per person, take away the ability to run live bait and cast at the same time. Like, to me, that seems like just no brainer rules to try and conserve our fisheries. And I know, and I don't want to put words in Pete's mouth, but I know Pete's talked about it on recent podcasts where it's like we want to have opportunities to catch. The average angler wants more opportunities, meaning more stocking or more available fish to catch. And to me, it seems like if we limit the rods and the opportunities that people have, and it's just one rod, one person, to me, that feels more fair catch than banning technology. I agree there's changes that need to be made with it, but wouldn't you agree that some of those other changes would be much easier?
It might be much easier, but they may not be nearly as effective as banning forward-facing sonar, which, by the way, is never going to happen. They might regulate it down to one transducer, but I don't think the people with the money that own these companies that are making that type of equipment would ever tolerate it being banned.
Well,
There'd be a lawsuit that the DNRs just can't afford to get involved in.
that there
So, but
again,
again, whether I don't look at it as fair play or ethical, but that's just me. But the matter of the fact is that if a bunch of newbies get in this sport because they can find the fish without having to know anything about musky fishing, and they can catch 3 or 4 a day, it ain't going to take long for that kind of pressure to just ruin everything.
no, I
So
agree.
three rods in a boat doesn't mean you're going to make them bite because you don't know where they're at. But if you've got the sonar to see where they're at, you can cast at them until you drive them crazy, and they either leave or they bite. So it's just here's a way to compare it. If you're deer hunting, you can't use a drone. But if you're musky fishing, you can use an underwater drone called forward-facing sonar. The deer in the woods can run a mile and get away from you. The muskie in the lake can maybe run a mile, but he can't get out of the lake, so he can't really get away from you.
No,
So
I totally agree. And talking with Pete off air just recently, we talked about this subject, and he's talked about it on a few podcasts too, where I think it's almost like when you guys back in the day started to go from catch and keep to catch and release, and it's going to take an initiative from some of the well-known musky anglers, some of the guides, to start to change the narrative on what it is they do, because people hire a guide and they see a guide using it, or they hire a guide only because he is using it. And until there's a change in the mentality of how people are going to fish at the highest level,
right,
it's not going to trickle down. And you only have to look on social media the last 5 to 10 years, and all the advancements we've made in musky fishing, and you tack forward facing sonar on top of that, and you see that there's a lot of people that are only fishing for the picture, and that is
right.
so unfortunate. But that's part of the world we live in, unfortunately. But I do think that we as an industry need to look at ways to preserve it. Obviously, we need this industry to succeed, because if we go out there and catch every fish and a majority of them die, it's not going to be fun for my kids to go out on eagle in 20 years if all you can do out there is sharpshoot because every fish has been caught or harassed. But that's the other side of this kind of equation, is who are we saving this sport for, Larry? Are we saving it
Yeah.
for my kids? Are we saving it for the guides of today to do better business? Or are we saving it for the guys that are just going to have the money to buy forward facing sonar? Because it, to me, you're right. They're not going to ban forward facing sonar. So people are always going to have it. You're always going to have bad apples. I see and hear the stories of people night fishing on Eagle Lake to this day. Obviously, if the MNR knew about it, there would be charges laid, whatever. We stay clear of that. But you hear rules are there, rules are going to be broken. I want to see this industry succeed because I want my wife's shop to succeed. I want all these companies that I work with to succeed, and I want my kids to have a fishery that they can go out and catch. But I hear so much of the negative talk comes from so many guides that think, and this, I have nothing against guides, I guide myself, but the guys that are making money from this industry are upset that it's the guys that just go out, buy a live scope, go out, catch fish, and they think that they're the ones, ruining the fishery. How do we find a balance in that, Larry? Like, that's the hard part for me to wrap my head around.
Yeah, that's a tough call, but I think, and you've obviously seen it as well as I have. Since let's say 1970, there weren't that many guides around. Now everybody with a boat's a guide. So that's what catch and release has created, just because there's more fish available and more notoriety of the numbers of fish that people are catching. Like musky clubs have their annual contest, and this guy caught 300 fish this year, and so it's fed on itself. To quote Al Linder, he said musky fishing is the only sport that's still growing, fishing sport, and so. But again, and from my way of thinking, the forward-facing sonar is only going to compound the problem, because if you get a bunch of people besides the guides out there using that equipment and catching them and don't know how to handle them, guides know how to handle them, most of them. I fished with one of the top guides on Green Bay a couple of years ago, and he had forward-facing sonar on his boat, but he said, I don't use it for musky fishing, which I had to think that was a good thing, because I probably wouldn't have been in the boat if he didn't using it. But we still caught a 56 incher, so he didn't need the forward-facing sonar to find the fish. But what's going to happen is, between the mortality that'll increase, handling mortality, and just because, for instance, Musky Inc. claims nearly 100% release. Well, that's what gets returned into the contest. But I guarantee if somebody accidentally kills one, they don't turn it in. That, plus the fact that, excuse me, the handling, the mortality, the more and more people get into the sport, more and more people handle them, there's going to be less and less fish. And then you compound that with forward-facing sonar. Let's say that you catch one and that you got a good release, and then the fish becomes suspicious of any sounds that sounded anything like what it sounded when you got caught. So they're going to get conditioned to it, eventually. Well, they're not only going to get conditioned to the sonar noise, they're going to get conditioned to boat noise. So if a boat comes near where they're swimming, they're going to get the hell out of Dodge before anybody ever knew they were there, forward-facing sonar or not. So that'll cut the ranks of the musky fishing down in a hurry, I can tell you that. Let's just hope that the fishery lasts long enough to survive that onslaught. But we are saving it for the kids.
I agree wholeheartedly with that, because up here in Canada, Northwestern Ontario, we have zero stocking, and I can't stress that enough to the listeners that are used to hearing about stocking numbers in the States, in the Midwest. Most of the muskie range, obviously, in the States, a lot of it's stocked. Here we have zero stocking. We have to be so much better in Canada. I recently talked to the president of Muskies Canada. I do want to have him on at some point, and he had said the MNR thinks isn't the right word. The MNR has agreed that our muskie population is healthy. Sarcastic air quotes, however you want to call that. I don't know what they use to say that, all of our muskie populations are healthy. That's what they're going on. I know we have some of the strictest rules up here. Again, one rod, one rod casting, not a sucker rig and a rod like we just mentioned, stuff like that. I think the night fishing, no night fishing on eagle is only positive for eagle. So I
Well,
know there.
let me tell you another positive thing that goes back a little bit into history, not real far, but when we first started fishing eagle, the size limit was 28 inches, 2 fish a day possession limit. Now, what do you think that would do to a fishery if that was the case today?
Wow.
The 54-inch size limit will always protect the eagle to a point, but if you get hordes of guys out there with forward-facing sonar catching them big suckers, even if they let them go, there's still going to be a percentage of mortality. Even the best musky fishermen on the planet kill a fish now and then, because I've seen it happen.
There's a couple things I want to ask there. One little quick thing. A couple of the lakes in our area still to this day have a 40-inch size limit. I've approached the MNR about trying to get those couple lakes increased to at least 48. I think from a tourism standpoint, it's a good selling point for a lake to have a 48-inch size limit versus 40. And it also protects the fishery because we are seeing fish over 40 caught and kept by certain groups of people that will, eat anything that they catch. It's well within their
Right.
rights because the size limit is there so that if they catch a 40 and above, they can keep it. But it's hard when we're trying to protect our species and we still have some of these older rules that are, again, not, in line with trying to protect it with the upper size limit. To change the subject
Well,
just slightly, Larry. No, go ahead.
well, to give you some background on that size limit thing, there's a reason those lakes have 40-inch size limit. The fish in those lakes just do not grow big. They cannot grow big. They don't have the right genetics, so they will never grow big. And if you put a 48-inch size limit on those lakes, you're going to have a total catch and release fishery, whether you want it or not.
Which I
Not that
think is
that's
what we
bad.
want, but I agree.
But,
One thing
I
I
mean,
want
you
to,
take there's lakes around Eagle that you can go and catch 15 fish in a day, but you won't catch any of them over 36 inches. I was in a little Lithium lake one time, and I had 7 fish behind my bait at one time, and the biggest one was about 24 inches. So those lakes just have they're little fish lakes, and they'll never have big fish. And there's reasons for that, but you probably don't have time on this podcast to go into it.
that is something that is interesting in our area, and maybe another time we can talk about that because we have fished a number of those lakes where it's a lot of smaller fish, and they're unique fisheries unto themselves. And for people that do visit this area, they're great places to bring kids because you get
Right.
a lot of action.
Kids and
For
beginners is the
beginners, yep.
perfect place.
You
Yeah.
can catch fish, you can practice handling them. I equate them
Right.
a lot more to a pike. They're much more resilient in the way they act. Great to go and learn, but to change the subject just slightly, and you just brought it up, and something that gets thrown around so much, Larry, is the mortality rate of just the natural byproduct of catching muskies. I know guys have talked about it on the Backlash podcast of, anywhere from 5 to 10, 15% of all fish, regardless of how well it's handled, are dying with delayed mortality. What's your thought on that? Because I want to ask you about how that pertains to some of the top anglers in North America versus like a weekend angler. What is your thought on what would an average delayed mortality take, the best handling practices in account? Where do you think delayed mortality sits?
I think it probably varies with the water body and the kind of pressure that it's getting. For instance, one of the big Minnesota lakes would have, even though it's nowhere near the size of Eagle, would have probably 10 times the pressure, if not more. So naturally, you're going to have more dead fish, but it not necessarily per angler. It's just the sheer number of fish that are being caught. versus uh, somebody who new at the game with forward facing sonar that catches a bunch of big fish and don't know how to handle them. So it can vary. I mean, there are some places where catch and release is I don't think probably there's any place where there isn't at least 10% mortality from handling, no matter who's doing it.
Okay, so when I take that and I look at, and I've heard this quote a couple times, and I think Pete Mena might have said it. Don't quote me on that. That 90% of muskies get caught by 10% of anglers, and
That's been pretty much the known for 75 years.
okay, so I think I heard it through Pete, but that
I
I
think
think
I think that's probably changed with today's
I would say
communications. Yeah, I'm sure it's probably more like 70-30 now, but
okay, fair
yeah,
enough. But even at that,
yeah,
you take some of the best anglers, and we don't have to mention any names, but some of these top guides are catching 250 to 300 muskies a year, and they're going to be the best at handling, but just on the law of averages, they're going to have probably, you know, a couple that are badly hooked or, stressed fish, whatever the case is, they're going to have a higher percentage of, fish that may be at risk versus a weekend angler that I'm going to say the average weekend angler, and I think these numbers are going up because people are fishing more and more, but just say the average weekend angler in the summer catches 10 fish. And if he has 10% mortality rate, he's going to lose one. The newbies, they don't have good handling practices. They're going to lose a couple. So I do agree that newbies and younger anglers are going to probably put fish more at risk. But I think that there's a case to be made that we need to obviously educate these newer anglers on handling, and I do see a lot more of that. Just to be fair, across social media, I don't care what guide or angler or any of these subscription based groups or Musky Insider that you look at, they're talking about handling in a lot more upfront manner, which I think is super positive. So I think that
yeah. I mean, if we could throw everybody's camera away, there'd be a lot more fish to live.
I agree.
In other
And
words,
we,
every fish you see on Musky Insider, somebody's holding it, and you don't see it in the water very often. You don't see a water shot. But people like Dick Pearson, who for 50 years has released them in the water without ever taking them out. So his percentage is probably near 100% for survival. But even him is going to have a deeply hooked fish now and then. So he's never going to have 100% success. But the more you can do to give the fish a break. For instance, how many pictures do you need of a 38-incher?
yeah, you
What
don't.
is the point of netting it, which means it can get wrapped up in the net? What's the point of taking it out of the net and holding it for pictures or placing it on a bump board? It's 38 inches. You've seen 1,000 of them. Put it back, leave it in the water, pop the hooks. I mean, just things like that can help the fishery, offset some of the problems with stuff we can't do anything about.
Yeah, I agree. And for our part through 54 bus, what we started doing last year is just using the floating measuring stick. And if it was something that we thought was, 38 or bigger, and we didn't just quite guess, we put the stick in. Okay, it's big enough. We just take the fish out. We show it to the camera. Like, we don't take still pictures. It's just their videos running, and we keep that camera going all the time. So it's showing that it's out of the net, it's up, it's in the water. We're trying to obviously lead by example. And there's some fish that, yeah, when they're short, we don't even, you don't do anything with it. You just dump it out of the net or boat side release if you can. The only, the caveat to that is when you do have new anglers, and obviously anybody that's a guide is going to have that new angler, that 38-inch fish is their personal best, and you have to,
That's a whole different ball game.
yeah, so you
They're
have to
only
be
going to have one.
mindful of that. But I totally agree. When you're a seasoned angler, we don't need to be doing everything with a 38-inch fish or a 40, a 40-inch fish, whatever that number
Yeah.
is for you. Unfortunately, this social media craze of, the wide angle pictures and the, just making every picture this super special moment, it grabs the attention. And we have tried to do more where we take a release shot, or if the fish is in the net and the lure's out, we can try and get a shot in the water. We just try to do something different. We are not perfect. I know of a couple fish in the past number of years here that we've had die on us, just deeply hooked fish, and there's nothing we can do. One, it just swallowed a swimming dog. It just, there's no, no way to recoup that one. And another one
No.
we hooked badly in the gills, and it's unfortunate. And it's one of those things when you're a musky angler and you kill a fish like that, it hits hard, because
Yeah.
that's something that I can go back and catch. And we've caught so many tiger muskies on recaptures that we're able to look back on and track over 4, 5, 6 years and have memories with these fish, to know that doing the right things leads to the right outcomes. And every time we get a recapture, there's a part of us that just smiles inside, because we know that we're doing our absolute best to try and, obviously catch these fish. That's hard on these fish. We understand that, but we have to do as much as we can to protect that fish, get it back in a healthy manner. And when you recapture it 5 years down the road, or maybe my daughter will catch it next year, it's such a good feeling to know that we can do the right thing. And I think a lot of us
Yeah.
are doing the right thing. I just think that more education is needed. And I look to, some of the biggest names in this industry to try and, lead by example, and be the ones that, lead that change, like guys like yourself and Pete Mena and the rest of these guys that started to change from catch and keep to catch and release, because it's going to take a mindset shift in the way that we do stuff, to get away from the grip and grin photos of every fish, and to move to obviously a more sustainable way of fishing. And I just, some of the things we talked about tonight, Larry, I think there's so much that we could look at and try and make better changes in this industry.
One thing I haven't suggested to the powers that be yet. I used to be international president of Muskies Inc., but Muskies Inc. has an annual members only fishing contest, and they measure to the half inch. There's no need for that. They need to get their thinking changed a little bit.
So one thing that up here in Canada, the Nestor Falls Muskie Cup, which my partner and I, David, had fished 4 or 5 years, I think now. It's been a video only tournament, and they provide you bump boards each day, and the video has to be of a fish in the water on the bump board in either a cradle or a net, and the fish cannot come out of the water. And I believe the rule at the tournament is, if it's over 50 inches and you need to put it on an official bump board to see if you have a 54-inch size, you can take it out of the water. I've seen people take pictures of fish in this tournament, but Dave and I, and the vast majority of them, you measure everything in the water. Things like that for some of these other tournaments, is that viable? To me, that seems like that would lead by example, whether it's the PMTT or any of these local tournaments. Just go to video in the water on a bump board provided by the tournament. To me, those are the kind of changes that I would like to see in the industry.
Yeah, there's always a better mousetrap. Just a matter of whether people want to adopt it or not.
Yeah, that seems to be the tough one. That's the sticking point on forward-facing sonar. That's the sticking point on changing the no night fishing rule, across the board. I've mentioned it to some people, and some people just, they think that's the worst idea ever. Well, they come up to Eagle Lake and they're upset that they can't fish at night. I get it, but we've adopted that rule because that rule's in place. We can't change that. I think when you look at groups like Muskies Canada, Muskies Inc., and you get some of these groups together and you try to make some changes for the betterment of the fisheries, people will, come on side. There's one other question I wanted to ask you, Larry, and I apologize if this is something that I should know, but do charter captains or guides have any restrictions on the hours they can be on the water? And the only reason I ask that is I see a lot of guides are doing double trips in a day. So they're out 16, 17, 18 hours a day. And again, that seems like something that would be an easy, whether it's a regulation. Is there anything in place like that?
Not that I'm aware of. I know some guides fish 12, 14 hours with one set of clients just because they want to catch fish. But I've always told those young guys that are doing that they're shooting themselves in the foot, because their clients are going to expect it in future years when they get old and can't do it anymore. So it's something to think about on their part.
Yeah, it's just something that I always wondered, because myself as a professional driver, we are legislated to only work X amount of hours per day. And I just, again, going back to the fact that the guides are going to catch the most fish. There's no question. They're the best anglers on the water, especially these top guides. And they're the top guides for a good reason. And I respect that. I just sometimes I wonder, when they're able to fish 16 or more hours a day, if that's, not again contributing to some of the pressure that we're seeing on these waters. And again, I'm not knocking anybody for making a living, because we all have to do it whatever way it is we choose to do it. And I do some guiding, but I'm not going to guide for 12, 14 hours, and I'm certainly not going to guide for 8 hours during the day and then take somebody out for a 5 or 6 hour trip at night. That's just personally, I don't want to do that, but I see people that do it. And again, I always wonder, who are
Well,
we?
one thing that could contribute to that is they've got $150,000 tied up in a boat and a truck, and they have to make money to pay for their equipment, or they can't do it.
Oh,
So that's,
it's not cheap. It's not a cheap sport by any stretch of the
you
imagination in
know,
today's world. It isn't.
so,
As we wrap this one up, Larry, and I appreciate all your time, I know you've talked about Eagle Lake a lot in the past, and believe it might have been on either your Musky War podcast or maybe the one where Lee Tauken was talking about it. You had mentioned the potential of a world record class fish coming from a place like Eagle. Let's add in Wabigoon, Lake of the Woods, and Lac Sewell. What's your thoughts on these three lakes? Truly,
okay.
truly,
Actually, you just mentioned four lakes,
yeah. But I'm just,
but okay. Let's start with Lake of the Woods. Uh, it's had more pressure than any body of water on the planet since the 20s, and it's never produced a legitimate 60-pounder that I'm aware of. So pretty much got to count that one out in my book. Wabigoon got potential to beat the devil. There's been fish handled there that were bigger than the world record. Now, first we need to define world record as well. I'm only talking from the point of what I consider the modern day world record, which is 58 pounds. I don't give any credence to any of the old historical fish. Um, with the possibility of Lawton's might have been legitimate, but I'm not 100% sure. But I do know for a fact that Eagle obviously has put out at least two 60-pound class fish that's been weighed. I know personally somebody that's caught a 60 by 60 that was not skinny. And that's fairly recent fish.
is that the
So I
Leonard
think Eagle.
Skyfish?
No.
Okay.
I don't even know much about Leonard Sky's fish. As much as I fished Eagle and heard that name, I don't know what he's claiming. But if the information I've seen on it, it's not legitimate. But that's another story. But eagle definitely, wabagoon definitely has the potential. Laxul has the potential, but it'll never be a world record because you can't keep the damn thing.
Yeah, agreed.
So you can't legitimately comply with any record organization's rules without keeping the fish.
One other question on the Laxul, the fish that Devoted Outdoors posted from last summer. I'm sure you've seen that fish following in that walk the dog topwater. What was your thoughts on that fish? It's clearly a
Oh
giant.
my God. Oh my God. That was my thought when I saw that follow. Yeah,
Yeah,
that's a big fish. That's a 60 by 60 probably.
I would tend to agree. That's right up there. I've personally
Yeah.
never seen a fish that big up close and personal. Probably the three biggest fish I've ever seen. One's on eagle, and it was all of mid 50 by I don't know how big it was. It was one of the biggest fish I've ever seen. And then I seen a really big one on long legged. My wife had it follow up, casting a grandma over some rocks, and it was in the upper 50 range. And then a few years back, I seen one on Peralt Lake that I would put into the 55-inch range. There was a 56 caught on Peralt about 5 years ago now that I didn't see a picture of it on the bump board. The guide holding it is a big guy, and I'm pretty sure it's in that mid 50s range. So there's some big fish up there. It's not going to be a world record lake, but there is some big fish there too. So I agree. The waters around here have that potential, and I think that's the draw of a lake like Eagle is
Yeah.
every.
I lost one there that was at least 60 inches. Um, Jumped right in front of me. I got a beautiful look at it. Big, long, fat thing. Looked like a railroad tie with fins. It took me 7 years to get over losing that one, but they're there. I thought you were talking about Herbie when we started out. I thought sure when he moved up there that he would be the next one to put a 60-pounder in the boat, but even he hasn't done it yet. So they're not lots of them out there, but they're priceless when you get to see one that caliber.
What's your favorite section of Eagle Lake?
Oh, that'd be giving away secrets.
Well,
Actually, yeah, there are several sections that have the potential. In fact, I don't know of any section on the lake that doesn't have the potential for a world record.
that's
Put it
fair.
that way.
That's fair enough.
I,
That's absolutely
I,
fair.
I would have to say my favorite sections are the sections that are closest to where my boat is, where I'm staying,
Yeah.
because when I was spending a lot of time up there, 30, 35 years ago, I'd run 60 miles a day. So, I wasted a lot of time running, and I was passing a lot of big fish on the way. So I kind of got over that. That's probably one of the reasons I got a bad shoulder, because I had a tiller that wanted to pull to the right all the time. And running 60 miles a day pulling that tiller was probably what ruined my left shoulder, but that's beside the point. But yeah, there's big fish in every section of Eagle Lake, so there's no reason to name a favorite one.
No, and that's kind of a common sentiment of all our shield lakes up here is you drive by 100 muskies to catch one. Uh, excuse me, they're everywhere. Eagle Lake it truly is a special place. I think the history of it is really special, and I, as a muskie angler, as somebody who's looking to get my kids and the next generation into this sport, Larry, I really like the fact that we're trying to be proactive on some of this stuff. And Canada's got strict rules, or Ontario has strict rules on especially eagle, the no night fishing. I think that's great. I don't ever want to see that changed, and I'm all for, let's educate, let's try, and if we are going to use forward facing sonar, let's use it in the best ethical way we can for those people that are going to do it. We have to find middle ground that's going to be acceptable for new anglers. It's going to be acceptable for the old guard that are really want to protect the sport. I think we can do it. We can find that balance. And I think we're going to find that in the next year or two, as fishing with more pressure gets tough, I think you're going to see a return to more of your classic diehard anglers. I think a lot of the the grip and grin anglers are going to kind of walk away from the sport when they realize it's a lot harder than they think when the pressure, ramps up. So I am looking
Yeah.
forward to positive change. And like I said in the beginning, Larry, I really want to say thank you for all that you've done to the sport and everything you do to keep the history alive, because I think all of us today, we owe, a debt of gratitude to everybody that came before us, and we have to just adopt and change. And you guys have proven that when we do that, we can make this better for the next generation.
That's the bottom line.
Well, thank you so much for this. I will like to get you back on again, because I think that what you brought up about some of these smaller lakes in the area and the different we up here, we don't call them different strains of fish from different lakes, but there's some really neat ecosystems on some of these smaller lakes that make them a lot of fun, like we said, for newer anglers. And there's a few other lakes in this area I would like to pick your brain about a little bit as well. Maybe we can do that in the future. Best of luck with this Musky Man movie coming out. I think I could speak for everybody in the musky industry is going to be watching that, and just appreciate again everything you've done.
I hope they enjoy it.
Well, guys, this has been another 54 minutes with insert name of legend here. And tonight it was one of the most legendary anglers to ever cast for a muskie, Larry Ramsell. Thank you so much. Guys, we'll see you on the next episode. Just a quick wrap up here. Thank you guys for sticking around and listening to this one. Hopefully you guys got some really cool value in it. The history part of it was amazing for my home area, and I do want to touch on some of the other subjects we talked about, because there's such a cool history in Northwestern Ontario, and Larry's the perfect guy to try and understand some of that history. So if you guys really like this one, drop a comment down below about some of the things you'd like to hear from somebody like Larry, or some of the other guests that you guys think you would like to see on this type of podcast content. And if you guys do like this one, check out the playlist here where it's all of our podcasts, and you hear me mention talking to Sarek, Booker, Steve Hiding, Jeremy Smith. I have a lot of other really cool guests on there, and it's turned out to be an amazing off season of talking to some of my heroes. So for now, 54 Bus is out of here. We'll catch you guys out on the water later.